She leads without asking for permission. Yet somehow she's the most misunderstood person in the room. Power looks different when it refuses to be loud. A Sigma female in leadership doesn't enter a space to be seen. She enters to understand. While others compete for attention, she observes patterns. While others speak to impress, she listens to decode. And while most leaders build authority through visibility, she builds it through presence. But that difference comes with a cost. Because when you don't follow the script people expect, they don't just misunderstand you, they try to define you. The first uncomfortable truth is this. Being a Sigma female means you will often be perceived as distant, even when you are simply focused. In most environments, leadership is associated with constant interaction, talking more, sharing more, being visibly involved at every moment. But she doesn't operate that way. She doesn't fill silence just to make others comfortable. She doesn't engage in conversations that don't serve clarity. And she doesn't explain herself unless it's necessary. To her, silence is not emptiness. It's control. But to others, silence feels like rejection. People begin to wonder what she's thinking. They question her intentions. They interpret her calmness as coldness, and slowly, without realizing it, they start creating a version of her that doesn't exist. She's hard to read. She's probably judging everyone. She thinks she's better. None of it is true. She's not distant because she lacks connection. She's distant because she doesn't need constant noise to feel secure. But here's the problem. In leadership, perception often matters more than intention. And when people can't read you, they fill in the blanks themselves. That's the weight she carries. Not because she's doing something wrong, but because she refuses to perform a version of leadership that isn't real. The second uncomfortable truth is this. The more independent she is, the more people feel unnecessary around her. Most leaders build loyalty by making people feel needed. They delegate constantly. They involve others in every step. They create systems where their presence feels essential. But a Sigma female doesn't rely on dependence. She can operate alone. She can make decisions without seeking approval. She can move forward even when no one is guiding her. And while that strength looks admirable from a distance, it creates discomfort up close. Because people want to feel valuable. They want to believe they play a role in the process. They want to feel like they matter. But when someone functions at a level where validation isn't required, it challenges that need. It makes others question their own importance. Not because she's taking anything away from them, but because she isn't asking for what they expect to give. And this is where tension begins. Colleagues may feel excluded. Teams may feel disconnected. Even allies may start to pull away. Not because she rejected them, but because they don't know where they fit in her world. She isn't trying to isolate herself. She simply doesn't build connections out of necessity. She builds them out of alignment. And alignment is rare. So while others form relationships quickly, hers take time. And in fast-moving environments, time is something people don't always have patience for. The third uncomfortable truth is this. Her emotional control makes people uneasy, even when it's her greatest strength. Most people rely on emotional signals to understand others. They look for reactions, expressions, changes in tone. It helps them feel grounded in interaction. But a Sigma female doesn't give away her emotional state easily. Not because she's hiding something, but because she has learned how to regulate it. She doesn't react instantly. She doesn't escalate situations unnecessarily. She doesn't let pressure dictate her behavior. She processes before she responds. And in high-stress environments, that makes her incredibly stable. But stability can feel unsettling to those who depend on emotional cues. Because when someone remains calm in moments where others would react, it creates uncertainty. Does she care? Is she affected at all? Why isn't she reacting? People start confusing control with detachment. They assume a lack of emotion, when in reality, it's the presence of discipline. She feels everything, but she chooses what deserves a response, and that choice is what sets her apart. However, this also creates distance, because people bond through shared emotional expression, through visible reactions, through mutual vulnerability. And when someone doesn't display those things openly, it becomes harder to connect on a surface level. But she was never built for surface-level connection. She values depth over frequency, meaning over display, clarity over comfort. And while that gives her an edge in leadership, it also places her slightly outside the emotional rhythm of others. The fourth uncomfortable truth is this: she will often be respected more than she is liked. In traditional leadership, likability is an asset. It creates trust, builds rapport, makes collaboration easier. But a Sigma female doesn't prioritize being liked. She prioritizes being real. She doesn't adjust her decisions to maintain approval. She doesn't soften truth just to protect comfort. And she doesn't pretend to agree when something doesn't align. She chooses honesty even when it's inconvenient. And honesty has consequences. It makes some people uncomfortable. It challenges existing dynamics. It disrupts expectations. But it also creates something stronger than likability. It creates respect. Because even those who don't fully understand her recognize her consistency. She doesn't shift based on pressure. She doesn't compromise her standards. She doesn't seek validation. And in a world where many leaders adapt themselves to fit expectations, that kind of stability stands out. But respect is different from connection. People may trust her judgment without feeling close to her. They may rely on her decisions without fully understanding her perspective. And that gap can feel isolating, because leadership isn't just about influence. It's also about human connection. And when you operate in a way that isn't easily relatable, you naturally stand apart. Not above, not below, just separate. And the fifth uncomfortable truth begins to reveal itself slowly. The higher she rises, the fewer people truly understand her. At lower levels, differences can be overlooked. People assume you're just different, or quiet, or independent. But as you move into leadership, those traits become more visible, more defined, more noticeable. And with visibility comes scrutiny. People start analyzing everything. The way she speaks, the way she listens, the way she responds or doesn't respond. Every decision becomes a signal. Every silence becomes a message. And suddenly, being different is no longer neutral. It becomes a point of focus. Some admire it, some question it, some feel threatened by it. Because leadership amplifies identity. It takes who you are and places it under constant observation. And for a Sigma female, that means her quiet nature becomes louder in perception. Her independence becomes more pronounced. Her emotional control becomes more noticeable. And the gap between how she sees herself and how others see her begins to widen. That gap is where misunderstanding grows. Not because she changed, but because the environment around her expects something different. Something more expressive, more visible, more traditional. But she was never built for traditional paths. She doesn't lead by dominating space. She leads by understanding it. She doesn't control people. She reads them. She doesn't demand attention. She commands it without asking. And yet, that quiet command often goes unnoticed by those who only recognize loud authority. So she continues. Not louder, not different, just consistent. And consistency is something most people don't fully understand until they experience its long-term impact. Because while others rise quickly through visibility, she builds slowly through depth. While others gain influence through presence, she gains it through precision. And while others rely on external validation, she operates from internal certainty. But that certainty comes with solitude. Not loneliness, but distance. A space where she doesn't need constant input, where she doesn't depend on approval, where she can think clearly without interference. And in that space, she becomes stronger, more focused, more aware, more intentional, but also more alone in how she sees the world. Because not everyone values clarity over comfort. Not everyone chooses independence over belonging. And not everyone is willing to stand apart, just to stay true. That's what makes her different. Not better, not superior, just aligned in a way most people aren't used to. And that alignment is both her strength and her challenge. Because the very traits that make her effective are the same traits that make her hard to understand. So she moves forward, not trying to be understood by everyone, but refusing to misunderstand herself. And that is where her real power begins to take shape. Say 2 to get the final 3,000 words. Chunk 2. Deeper, sharper, and more psychological. No repetition, full continuation. 2. Here is chunk 2, final to 3,000 words. Clean continuation, no repetition. Deeper psychological layer, and a strong ending. Narrator, chunk 2. There's a moment in every Sigma female's leadership journey where something shifts, not outside, but inside. It's subtle. At first, she doesn't notice it. She continues working the same way, thinking the same way, moving with the same quiet precision. But then patterns begin to repeat. The same misunderstandings, the same distance, the same reactions from different people, in different places. And eventually, she realizes something uncomfortable. It's not about the environment. It's about the nature of who she is within it. Because when you operate outside of expected behavior long enough, you stop being seen as an individual and start being seen as an exception. And exceptions are rarely understood. They're observed. They're analyzed. Sometimes they're even admired, but they're not always included. And that leads to one of the most overlooked realities of Sigma leadership. She often becomes the standard others compare themselves to, without ever being part of the group. People watch her. They study how she handles pressure, how she makes decisions without hesitation, how she remains steady when situations become chaotic. But instead of approaching her to understand, they observe from a distance, because there's something about her presence that feels complete. Not perfect, but self-contained. She doesn't project need. She doesn't search for approval. She doesn't signal uncertainty. And that creates an invisible boundary. Not one she intentionally builds, but one that naturally forms around her. Others hesitate to cross it, not because she pushes them away, but because they don't feel invited. And this is where isolation quietly deepens, not through rejection, but through perception. Because people are more likely to connect with someone who appears open, even if that openness is surface level. While she, on the other hand, offers depth, but only to those who reach it. And most people don't. Not because they can't, but because they're not used to connections that require patience. So she continues leading, present, aware, focused, but increasingly aware of the distance between her and others. Not in position, but in experience. Because leadership for her isn't about controlling outcomes. It's about understanding dynamics. And over time, she begins to see something clearly. People don't resist her authority. They resist what they don't understand about it. Because her leadership doesn't follow emotional patterns. It doesn't rely on motivation speeches. It doesn't depend on constant reassurance. It doesn't revolve around visibility. It operates on clarity, on structure, on internal alignment. And while that makes her incredibly effective, it also removes the familiar signals people are used to. So instead of feeling guided, some feel disconnected. Instead of feeling included, some feel uncertain. And uncertainty often turns into quiet resistance, not loud enough to confront, but strong enough to affect dynamics. Subtle disengagement, unspoken tension, distance that no one directly addresses. And she notices it, not emotionally, but analytically. She sees how energy shifts in a room, how conversations change when she enters, how people adjust their tone, or avoid it entirely. And instead of reacting, she studies it, because that's what she does best. She doesn't just experience environments. She reads them. And what she begins to understand is this. Her presence forces people to confront their own inconsistencies. Not intentionally, but naturally. Because when someone operates with internal stability, it highlights the instability in others. When someone doesn't seek validation, it exposes how much others depend on it. When someone remains calm under pressure, it reflects how others react without control. And that reflection is uncomfortable. Not because she's doing anything wrong, but because she's showing something real, something unfiltered. And most people aren't used to that, so they respond in different ways. Some admire her from a distance. Some misunderstand her intentions. Some feel challenged by her presence. And some quietly compete, not for position, but for identity. Because when you stand next to someone who is internally grounded, it forces you to question how grounded you are. And not everyone is ready for that. So instead of aligning with her, they create distance, and distance over time becomes a pattern she recognizes, a pattern she doesn't try to fix, because she understands something most leaders don't. Not every gap needs to be closed. Some gaps exist because alignment isn't there, and forcing alignment only creates friction, so she allows it, not with indifference, but with awareness. She doesn't chase connection. She doesn't force understanding. She doesn't dilute herself to fit expectations. She stays consistent, and consistency is what eventually reveals everything. Because over time, people begin to see what she was doing all along. They notice the precision in her decisions, the calmness in her responses, the clarity in her direction. They realize that what felt distant was actually intentional, that what felt quiet was actually controlled, that what felt different was actually effective. But by the time they understand it, she's already moved forward, because she doesn't wait for recognition. She moves with certainty, and certainty doesn't pause for validation. But even with that strength, there's a reality she cannot avoid. Leadership at her level becomes less about connection and more about acceptance of solitude. Not isolation in a negative sense, but a space where fewer people truly relate, where conversations become more selective, where interactions become more intentional, where she no longer expects to be understood by everyone, and no longer needs to be. Because understanding for her isn't something she demands. It's something she recognizes when it exists, and when it doesn't, she continues anyway. That's the difference. She doesn't slow down to match comfort. She doesn't adjust her direction to fit expectations. She moves based on clarity. And clarity is not always shared, but it is always powerful. Because when you operate with clarity, you eliminate hesitation. You remove doubt. You reduce noise. And what remains is direction. That's what makes her leadership different. Not louder, not more visible, but more precise. And precision creates impact that doesn't need constant attention. It builds over time, quietly, consistently, unshakably, until one day it becomes undeniable. And that's when everything changes. Not in how she leads, but in how she's perceived. Because once results become visible, people stop questioning the method. They start respecting it. They begin to trust what they once misunderstood. They follow what they once doubted. And suddenly, the same traits that created distance become the reason for her authority. But here's the final truth, the one that sits beneath everything. She was never leading to be understood. She was leading to be aligned. Aligned with her values. Aligned with her thinking. Aligned with her way of seeing the world. And that alignment is what allowed her to stay consistent. When others changed based on pressure, it's what allowed her to remain calm. When others reacted emotionally, it's what allowed her to move forward. When others waited for approval. And that's why her leadership works. Not because it fits expectations, but because it doesn't depend on them. So if you ever find yourself feeling misunderstood in your leadership, if people misread your silence, your independence, your control, understand this. It's not a flaw. It's a different structure, a different way of operating, one that isn't built for constant validation, but for long-term clarity. And clarity was rare, which is why people don't recognize it immediately. But when they do, it changes everything. So she continues. Not louder, not softer, just exactly as she is. And that's what makes her presence impossible to ignore. Even when she says nothing at all,